Anyone who knows me will tell you I've been in on my share of console launches, and probably then some. I've got a video coming up soon about how we can fix system launches, and believe me, do they ever need fixing. So I figured I'd preface it by looking back on my first 7 or 8 launches, which really helped define my view of what the system launch experience should be. We'll go in chronological order, which means today I'll be going over my experience with the Dreamcast launch. This was a unique launch for me because I was 17 years old, making it the one system launch I got in on before I could join the workforce. Go allowance. And it was also a little over a year before Sony came along with the PlayStation 2 and completely changed the way system launches are handled. Honestly, my way of going about the Dreamcast launch would be a lesson in what not to do in the post-PS2 era. Going into Dreamcast launch, I had very high expectations, and I was completely game-starved to make matters worse. By nature, I am not a one-system gamer, I'm just not built that way. Because of this, the Dreamcast marked the end of a truly bizarre year for me. In the spring of 1998, Sega decided to pull the Saturn out of the US market, and to make matters worse, Nintendo lost my faith later that year with The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and F-Zero X, leaving me as strictly a PlayStation gamer, which really goes against my nature. Of course, I use that term loosely as well, since it suggests I spent the whole time buying PlayStation games. And that's not going to happen when you're staring down a hardware launch that coming fall without the kind of cash flow a steady paycheck gives you. So I spent the time leading up to the Dreamcast launch with games I already had, like Street Fighter Alpha 3, Grandia, and R4 Ridge Racer Type 4. Thankfully, all provided me with the hours of gaming I needed to last those months without any new thumb candy. As the Dreamcast launch grew closer, the launch list started to pull itself together, up until the official Dreamcast magazine kicked off with what it claimed to be the launch list. More on that in a bit. I wasted no time in making my selections. Marvel vs. Capcom, Virtua Fighter 3 TB, and the King of Fighters Dream Match 1999. I was very focused on the fighting genre at the time, even more so than I am now. So I had my plan. I knew how much money I would need. It was safe to commence the stoking. I spent a few weeks reading previews, obsessing over screenshots, and really just giggling like a maniac. My only purchase leading up to the Dreamcast street date was August 30th's Risk album by Megadeth, which has its reputation, but I honestly enjoyed it. Then, a week and a half later, the day arrived, September 9th, 1999. I hadn't slept at all the night before. I was just playing a bunch of Street Fighter, clearing space for my Dreamcast on the desk I kept my systems on at the time, and going over the same issue of DCM I had been fixated on from the start. The store I planned on picking my system up from, Fred Meyer, was to open at 7 a.m. Maybe I was imagining what launches would eventually become because I set out at what was in hindsight the ridiculous time at 5:15 a.m., giving me an hour and 45 minutes to walk to a store a little over 8 blocks from my house. I did stop at the 7-Eleven on the way to the store, picking up a bag of Doritos and a Coke, but otherwise I made tracks toward Fred Meyer, and making good time cost me. The good news is that I was the only one there. After all, this was before the PS2 came along and made system launches into what we see them as today. There was no line, there were no campers, just a big empty parking lot, and me with just enough snacks to eat before the store opened. The bad news was that I still had to wait. I hate waiting. 7 a.m. finally rolled around and the doors opened. I immediately headed for the home electronics department at the back of the store and saw a tower of Dreamcasts right in the middle of the department. I wasted no time grabbing one of those before I started looking for games. That's where things got different. They had all of one game in stock, more copies of Sonic Adventure than the average Walmart would have copies of Madden NFL 2001 a year later at the PS2 launch. If you know, you know. I had never seen anything like it before, nor have I since. Just one huge CD rack devoted to what turned out to be, if I'm completely honest, a pretty average mascot platformer. I declined on the platforming and instead just grabbed a second controller and headed out. I arrived home around 8, promptly setting the Dreamcast up with about an hour to check out the demo disc before I would have to leave again. I still had 3 launch games to pick up after all, and the bus to the mall would arrive by my house at around 9:20. Going over the demo disc, very little actually stood out. I felt semi-justified in not giving up one of my planned launch games for the moment to pick up Sonic Adventure instead, and Ready to Rumble failed to make any sort of impression, but I absolutely loved Champ Car Racing, which actually got a name change to Flag before going gold, and Power Stone was mildly amusing as well. After checking out the demos, I still made it out to the mall by the time it opened at 10. Back then, KB Toys was the best place in town to buy games on their release dates. I spent about 20 minutes before the mall opened talking to about 5 other people who showed up for the launch, and that number seemed to triple by the time the store opened, and I actually ran into a couple of friends of mine. One wasn't there for the Dreamcast, but rather for the simultaneous release of Final Fantasy VIII that day. Another friend, like me, picked up his Dreamcast earlier in the day at the Shopco across from the mall and was just there for games. And if memory serves, he picked up Soul Calibur, Hydro Thunder, and a VMU. It was then that I found out, much to my irritation, that none of the games I wanted made the final launch list. To make matters worse, the Dreamcast had no internal memory, which seems strange to me since the Saturn did, even if just a little, which made the VMU a necessity. Forced to improvise, my purchase at KB suddenly became Soul Calibur, Final Fantasy VIII, and oh, how I later regretted that one, and a VMU, leaving me with just enough money to pick up one more game. Still in denial that all three of my anticipated Dreamcast games fell off the launch, I left the mall without buying Sonic Adventure, but would eventually give in and hand $50 off to my mom before her planned trip to the store later in the day in order to pick it up while she was there. I had most of the Soul Calibur characters unlocked by the time I fell asleep, which I would assume to be sometime around 2:30 p.m. since I'd been up all night. Still, 8 hours of sleep later, I was good to go once again and eventually got around to starting Sonic Adventure and even pulling myself away from the Dreamcast long enough to regret buying Final Fantasy VIII. In the ensuing days, I traded off a massive number of PlayStation games as well as most of the N64 library that I hardly ever touched at this point at the local indie store Fun Unlimited. My Dreamcast library was significantly larger within the week, with Hydro Thunder, NFL Blitz 2000, Mortal Kombat Gold. The shallow fighting game lineup at launch left me scraping the bottom of the barrel, I suppose. Power Stone and Trick Style, all being added at a disturbing pace. I certainly wasn't hurting for variety while I waited for the 3 games that I bought the Dreamcast for in the first place. However, even before I would get these games, the Dreamcast offered me some high-quality gaming, Mortal Kombat and Trick Style notwithstanding. It was the dawn of a new gaming generation, but it carried with it the heart and soul of the one prior, which is one of the reasons I think the system is so beloved to this day. Ultimately, I decided that the Dreamcast launch was such a good time that I would never miss out on another, and I wouldn't until the PS3, which priced me out, and the Wii, which just didn't have anything that interested me off the jump. Throughout this series of videos, I will be sharing my experiences with the launches I vowed not to miss because of the Dreamcast. You'll hear about the good, the bad, the outright bizarre, the close calls, and the rest of the sometimes indefinable moments that make system launches truly momentous occasions. Next time, of course, I will be talking about the launch that changed every launch to follow, the PlayStation 2. This was perhaps my most anticipated launch of all the ones I'll be talking about over the next several days, and with good reason. It turned system launches into events that gamers had to go to, rather than the attitude that preceded the PS2 of, oh, that's out, I guess I'll have to go pick it up in a couple of days. That's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. Until next time, I'm Patrick Mifflin, sounding off.